Well, good morning, Your Worship, councillors, to our staff as well, and to members of the media. If we have any members of the public, welcome. And of course to those who are looking from afar, no mai haramai, welcome to our Strategy, Policy and Finance Committee meeting today, 13th of July 2017. Now, do we have... please just remember that we are streaming live, so if you can put your microphone on and bring it towards you so everybody out there somewhere, hundreds and thousands, that they can hear us clearly when we're speaking. Thank you. Thank you. Any apologies, please? I do have an apology for lateness for Councillor Maxwell. Any other apologies? Thank you. Well, I'll just take a mover and a seconder, please, that apology for lateness be accepted. Thank you. Thank you, Mrs. Trumper. Thank you, Councillor Kent. All those in favour, please say aye. Thank you. Any declarations of interest this morning, please? Thank you. Items that are not urgent but you'd like to have placed on the agenda? Yes, Mr. Berriman-Kemp.
So, Madam Chair, I will have a declaration of interest to declare when we get into the confidential section.
Thank you very much. So noted. Thank you. Item number 4. Yes, Your Worship, sorry.
Madam Chair, just if we could acknowledge the loss to the community of Heather McKechnie, a wonderful community soul, had a lovely send-off by really the voluntary sector of our community.
Yes.
So appreciated her work in the Citizens Advice Bureau, U3A, the Curtin Bank, Progress Nongataha, just some wonderful community work that she'd done. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. It is sad when we lose someone who has contributed so much to our community. Thank you for that. Confirmation of minutes. The minutes of the Strategy, Policy and Finance Committee meeting held on the 8th of June. May I have a mover and a seconder, please, for those minutes? Thank you, Councillor Kent. Thank you, Mr. Thomas. Thank you. Are there any amendments or corrections? No, thank you. I'll put that the minutes of the Strategy, Policy and Finance Committee meeting held on the 8th of June 2017 be confirmed as a true and correct record. All those in favour, please say aye. Contrary, thank you. Now we're into our staff reports. Thank you. Our first report is the Spatial Plan Discussion Document. May I have a mover and a seconder, please, to receive the report? Thank you very much. It's moved Councillor Gould, seconded Councillor Hunt, that the report, Spatial Plan Discussion Document feedback be received. All those in favour, please say aye. Contrary, thank you. Good morning, JP. You're going to do speak to the report and also give us a brief PowerPoint presentation. Is that correct?
Yes, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
So, Madam Chair, I alluded to a number of things that were underway at the O&M meeting last week. So this is a number of actions which are continuing around the spatial plan process. So I just thought it was important to go through those and just give you some context. And then, of course, we can dive into the detail of the spatial planning report that's here before you. So, councillors, I've just titled this up, and you notice I've actually dropped the spatial plan title to under the heading of future development strategy. And as we move forward, you'll just you'll get a feel for why I've done that. So, councillors,
excuse me, JP. Can I just ask, are these what you're going to present now? Were these actually contained in the report, or is this sort of a bit of a widening out, or more information for us?
Madam Chair, it's actually widening out because there's a number of actions which are happening outside of the discussion document. So if you can just see up there on the screen, I signalled that we were heading down to Wellington because the latest Stats New Zealand has moved us from a low growth to a medium growth council. Now that obviously has some relevance to that future land planning that we need to undertake, and we now have to meet a few requirements under the National Policy Statement. So, Madam Chair, these are sort of things which contribute into our discussion around the spatial plan. So I'll just run through these in a bit more detail. Through the O&M committee, I also signalled that Henry and I have been working on just pulling together a variety of threads which we've sort of identified as the Housing and Growth Action Plan, of which the spatial plan is part. So I'll just give you a little bit of a brief of the framework we're working on, and we'll be looking at bringing back in more detail an action plan which just details some of the things we're working on. We'd also like just to go through a discussion around local MP Todd McClay made an announcement about the need for a housing accord in Rotorua to address some of our issues. That's subsequently been followed up with a meeting with Minister Smith, who's the Minister of Environment and also Housing. So I'd just like to report back on that through here as well. And Her Worship and the Deputy Mayor were in attendance at that meeting, and they might want to make some comments about the meeting as well. And finally, I've got an additional recommendation which is proposed to go on the back of the spatial planning report. So that's detailed at the end of this presentation. So councillors, just the first thing here is we've just been talking about the growth requirements. So you've heard me say that we've now been moved to a medium status council. So this is for the Rotorua urban area. So Stats New Zealand have now done their 2015 update, which has identified growth projections for the Rotorua urban area of 7.2% for the period of 2013 to 2023. So that's the numbers that we're working on. Having done that, those projections, Stats New Zealand now means we've qualified under the National Policy Statement to meet that medium growth status. So there's the requirements there. Has to have a population of more than 30,000, so obviously Rotorua City, so that's why I mentioned Rotorua urban area, and a projected growth to be between 5 and 10% between that period. So that's why we're now classed as a medium growth council. High growth, for your information, is over 10% growth. So that's where we fit within that, and that's the National Policy Statement on urban development capacity. Now, because we've now reached that medium status, that puts some additional reporting requirements on us. So I'll just go through some of those. So the key policies under that National Policy Statement, and I've just picked there's about 6 areas, but 3 key ones are that we need to ensure that there's capacity for housing and business. So we've now got some short, medium and long-term requirements around making sure that there's enough land that is zoned, feasible and serviced. So I think one of the things that's important for us in regard to the spatial plan is that we've been focusing on the zoned and the serviced. So that's one of the key parameters that we were looking at within the spatial plan. The feasible now brings in this commercial feasibility or commercial viability. So MB has a really useful tool that they've made available to us and to other councils on their website, which is really just to look at the costs of development to produce either commercial or industrial land. And then the building costs. So for them it's quite important that we have a financial viability or a commercial viability lens over the top of any of the areas that we see as being potentially zoned for future development. So the other part of it is, so that's the short term. Medium term is if you're zoning, you've also got to take a view of, so in those future areas, have you put aside the funding to do those servicing, so whether that's water, sewage or roading. And then in the long term, obviously there's a relevance to the infrastructure strategy, so that's where it fits within those local government requirements. So the other part of it too is the responsive planning policies. So in addition to say, okay, you've got growth of X, therefore you need this much land which is feasible, zoned and serviced, they also think there needs to be an additional margin of at least 20%. So that's quite important for us as we go through our spatial planning process. You know, we've talked about looking out to the future when we might have a population in the district of approximately 100,000, which for us equates to about 17,000 household units. We also have to then look at something that includes a plus 20%. So that's that sort of thinking that we need to start looking at. What land is available across the district for the future? And then obviously the other requirement is it's sort of a recommendation for medium growth as opposed to a requirement, but it's definitely a requirement for fast growth areas or high growth areas, which was this future development strategy. So in essence, when you look at what's detailed under a future development strategy, it is a spatial plan. Spatial plan by a different name. So those are the 3 core parts of that National Policy Statement. So we just think that was quite relevant. So again, councillors, if you're asked about what's happening with the growth for Rotorua over the next few years, I would recommend that you suggest that Stats New Zealand and therefore MB and Ministry for the Environment have identified that our projections based on the 2013 baseline is for 7.2% out to 2023. So that's the projections they are working off. I might just pause there in case there's any questions on that.
Thank you. Yes,
Madam Chair, thank you JP for your report. When you say growth of 7.2% over 2013 to 2023, is that 7.2% per year or over those particular 10-year period?
It's over the whole period.
JP, I think I'd prefer it if you just moved ahead and then we'll, because I'm sure there'll be quite a lot of discussion, questions coming towards the end. Thank you.
So, councillors, that's just the national policy statement. Now, during Councillor Sturt's meeting last week, O&M, I just talked about how we're starting to look at just putting together a number of responses to what is a complex issue for our city. So growth and housing is not got one solution. So we've just been looking at how we structure that and look at the current actions that we're undertaking. So we're just starting to build up an action plan now. So this is just, and so we'll be bringing this back to you. So the reason why I put draft in the corner is you haven't seen this before, so this is just how we're looking to frame it up. So we'll be bringing this back to you at a later date. But really for us, and probably the core I wanted to just sort of show you was this view of saying, look, there's one particular area that we've got to look at: land availability, the zoning, the spatial planning. Another area which touches on a number of challenges in our community around affordability. So obviously there's the Housing New Zealand response, there's our consideration of a housing trust. Similarly, in the business growth quadrant, we're looking at issues around development out around the airport. We've talked about our own development company, and obviously that's an opportunity there as well. So there's those spaces. And finally, this other one about saying we've already got a neighbourhood reinvigoration fund. We probably need to look in more detail about how we can leverage that more effectively to focus on regenerating some of our suburbs, which is a key priority. So all of those areas are interlinked and they all form part of our growth and housing response, and we'll just be looking at coming back to you with more detail on that. But that's basically the framework where we're looking at coordinating some of the actions that are currently underway. So, councillors, one of the announcements that was made on the 4th of July was our local MP, Mr Macleay, had made a comment that really with the pressures that were being experienced in Rotorua, we needed to have a housing accord in place. He's moved very quickly, and on the 11th of July, so I think a couple of days ago, Mr Macleay and Minister Smith, with some advisors from MB, came along and met with Her Worship the Mayor and the Deputy Mayor and a number of staff members. So they were very keen and believed that based on our medium growth and the pressures we were experiencing, we needed, or we should be looking to work with them around getting a housing accord in place. So they are very keen to move that quickly forward, and so basically what the accord does, it's an agreement which just establishes the relationship to work together and look at some of the actions that need to be taken to address each local area's complexities and the issues that are there, and also set some targets about the number of sections and houses that are built in a particular area for a period. So that's the sort of the key opportunity there. So the other part of it, which is particularly of relevance, I believe, for us, is in setting up a housing accord, it gives you an opportunity to establish special housing areas. Now, this might be particularly useful for us because it gives us the chance to speed up some zone changes or plan changes to enable sort of future growth. So that's that ability to move more quickly through a plan change process and change land, for example, to residential. So we think that's quite important as a way of implementing our spatial plan once it's complete. Obviously the risk with the spatial plan is that we've moved quite quickly through the process with our community. Expectations grow, then that certain actions will follow. But then if you go back into a normal plan change process, you may get bogged down, depending on people's objections or the Environment Court involvement, for a number of years. So your implementation can slow dramatically. So for us, this is a particularly useful opportunity to make sure that we can implement our spatial plan effectively. So the other things that we talked about was to look at surplus reserves, and obviously Council's been talking about that for some time, surplus Crown land and other land that might also provide some opportunities for housing development. Minister Flavel has raised it, and we've made reference to it within our spatial plan comments about the opportunities to improve our papakainga provisions within our district plan, so that's certainly an immediate action we might need to look at, and government support might be helpful in that space. But also establishing a housing accord brings other government departments and entities into thinking that there's certain objectives to be achieved in a particular area. So for us, that's pretty important in our conversations with NZTA. And obviously we've already got some work underway with Housing New Zealand. So a pretty good opportunity for us to work with government in this space. I might just pause. I don't know if Her Worship or the Mayor would like to make any, or Deputy Mayor, comments.
If that's right, through the chair. Thank you. Thank you for that, JP, and a very good summation of both the preparation that council officers put together in time for us to meet with the Minister on Tuesday. I was very impressed with the information and wanted it to be shared with you here today so that all council understood the background that we presented to the Minister. My view of the meeting was enormous relief, actually, that there is now an acceptance of medium growth. And it puts to rest and to bed where we were for a decade of 0.01% growth up until 2013. So this doesn't put us in that fast growth, and so we don't get that access to the funding that the Prime Minister announced. But it is the beginning, if we can get the framework agreed now with officials through Minister Smith, to actually get onto the schedule before the House and before the House rises. So that's why I wanted it to be here, because it then goes into a carryover motion for any new government to pick up. And this is the end of a lot of strategy work, both through Minister Joyce, Minister Bridges, about NZTA and asserting that we are growing, and now with Minister Smith. So I think it's been a very concerted strategy to build to this, along with our Vision 2030 strategy. So well done, councillors, because the story is now starting to be developed and understood in central government. So it is the bits, I was very clear that it is about the opportunity after the discussion on the spatial plan. And I must say, JP, to you that I've had feedback meeting the Rotorua Community Association, how much they enjoyed the meetings discussing what could be the future of Rotorua, where growth could be. And they loved being involved. So that's really cool that these discussions have gone on all around the district. So that even has enabled us to be ready enough to convince the Minister that we're ready to be to move on a framework for a housing accord. So it's great news for Rotorua. It doesn't give us that funding that we thought, but it gives us, as JP said, the chance to work together. And then when the funding requirement is there, working it through that way. Also, if you could just go back, JP, to the 4 quadrants of the challenges, that's a reflection of both our district plan and our spatial plan and also our infrastructure plan. So all of those components are there, and we were very determined to put forward, it's not only about opening new housing areas or new land, opening up new land, it was also about regenerating our suburbs. So we got that front of mind. Now what will happen with this is officials will work with the ministry officials to agree our housing accord. and then that gets signed off by the Minister and gets put before the House as a schedule amendment to the Act. So that's the process going forward, and I'm really impressed that you got us to this stage at this time. It was a perfect political moment, really, to be able to use. So it's also going to mean, and we're not going to go straight into it, there is going to have to be a mechanism for council law and community board and Te Tato involvement in how we would ever implement the how bit of this accord. So watch this space, because we need council laws and elected officials to be involved too. So I think it's great. It's a first step, and we've been arguing for this for since we got elected this time, when we started our refresh of Vision 2030. So all that work built up to help us put a logic argument before the Minister. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Worship. Can I just say I'm somewhat disappointed that that there weren't a couple of other councillors along at the meeting that you had with Councillor Donaldson and yourself. And it's only because obviously this has occupied the minds of many of us for some years. And I particularly I think of Te Tato, because if you're talking about where land might become available, they're thinking of things already. And it's just, yeah, it would have been nice for some other line of thinking to have been perhaps even injected at that stage. The question I would like to ask of you, where have housing accords been successful so far in New Zealand? I know there's a number.
Yeah, JP, you might like to answer that, because that was one of our questions, so that we weren't caught in others that talked about how many affordable homes have been delivered through an accord, and we asked where's the best practice exemplar that we could look at to say, you know, that sort of fits us. Do you want to answer that bit, JP?
Madam Chair, yes, it was a question that we touched on with the Minister, and he parochially put his own hat on and said, well, you just need to look at my council, and he was speaking of Nelson. So he saw them being of similar kind of issues that we were experiencing there. They also have a housing trust situation where they have established, so they had a special housing area identified in that space. So he said that was a good example. He steered us away from looking at some of the really large things that were happening in Auckland, and said, look, there's lots of smaller cities that were probably better examples for us to consider. So I think there's some discussion about New Plymouth as well. They're obviously in a space where they've got some development going on, and they've got a future development strategy in place there. So he did cite a number of examples, and Henry and I are talking to MB officials about making sure that we pull up those agreements and look at specifically what's been happening in those areas as well. But certainly the Minister suggested Nelson was a good example.
Councillor Donaldson, thank you.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Just if I can add to what JP's just said, one of the insights that was quite interesting for us was that some of these special housing areas can be as small as four lots or 4 units. So the mechanism enables quite nimble development of land that's inappropriately zoned, and gives that opportunity to move ahead with the development much quicker than a plan change would take for quite small suite developments.
I do want to add, just in response to why others weren't invited, we responded very quickly to the request from the Minister to come, and it warranted a very quick political response. And as Councillor Donaldson leads the economic development portfolio, that was not a meeting to clutter up with politicians. It was a meeting for us to meet the officials, assess the depth of the commitment, and then politicians will definitely be involved in the framework development. Also, I wondered, JP, if I should signal a new recommendation here. I don't know if you framed one. Well done. If you go back, it's number 4. It should be. Yeah, go back to the presentation. This is to enable a resolution before us that staff can proceed with the development of the framework. And this has to be done relatively quickly because it has to go through council. There is no framework agreed yet. This is to proceed. And this then has to get before the House within the next 6 weeks. Just agreement in principle to proceed. No, you had...
Any agreed framework, Your Worship, comes back to this committee?
Of course.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, just closing it off,
Yeah.
but my preceding slide there was, and the reasoning here just brings it why these things that are spinning around the side of the spatial plan are so important. Obviously, if you start looking at that future development strategy part of the national policy statement, there's just some additional tools we need to make sure we're covering off when we put our spatial plan together, and that's that commercial viability one I've talked about, and just making sure that certainly within our draft we've covered that off. We also want to make sure that the spatial plan is not seen as a silver bullet, and certainly not. It's got to sit within a wider set of actions that we're undertaking around housing, of which a housing accord is another, not silver bullet, but another piece that works on that puzzle. And obviously then there's just the request for us to move into using a housing accord and special housing areas as a way of implementing what we get out of the spatial plan, so hence that recommendation there. So, Madam Chair, I'm happy to answer any other questions, or I could move into just talking about the spatial plan paper itself.
Well, could I signal that I wish to move additional point 4 as a recommendation when we come to consideration?
Thank you. There's a number of councillors want to speak now. Councillor Stewart, then Ms Morrison.
Yeah, Madam Chair, to a certain degree I'm going to play the devil's advocate because I hear what you said in terms of, I didn't particularly want to meet Nick Smith. I think he's absolutely personal view, created absolute special housing disasters right around the country. But I think it's really important that, and I hear what Her Worship says, that councillors around this table need to walk with us and be part of it, because, you know, some announcements yesterday, is Rotorua going to continue to be the poor cousin of Tauranga? $278 million for housing over the next 10 years, and what do we get? Diddly squat. Not even a mention. However, I have also seen over the years, and we've been around local government for a long, long time. I mean, we've had special housing areas and special housing accords, and what's happened is they've all been grouped in one lower socio-economic areas that no one wants to live in. I mean, there are houses in Rotorua empty in certain areas now that nobody will live there because of the social demographic of that area. So I hope I will support getting on board, but I'm going to have a very guarded view of what this all means, and that's why I believe maybe, Madam Chair, we didn't need to meet the Minister, but certainly we needed to be involved in what is a housing accord, what is a special housing area in terms of that act. We need to own that as part of our community. I mean, we've got submissions here. I mean, who's going to be identifying where these special housing areas go? Is it going to be Linmore? Is it going to be Owhata? Is it going to be Nongata, Hamarana? Yes, we are, but we need to know on what basis we are going to, because I understood when we did the district plan, and correct me if I'm wrong when you speak, Councillor Hunt, when we did the district plan, which took us 15 years to do, what came up was that there's still a lot of infill within what we used to call the urban fence, which included from Hannah's Bay, Holden's Bay, right around the lake to Kawaha Point, and also included Hamarana, etc. So I know that we will identify them, but we need to take our community with us, because we don't want the repeats of what happened in the past. We're all low-cost housing. Everyone talks about affordable. Affordable to who? It's only affordable to if you can buy it or the bank can fund it. But I don't want to see a conglomeration of low cost, low demographic, low social impact people all being shovelled into certain areas within this district. So I want to play an active role in that, and I hear what Her Worship is saying, that will occur. So I think a lot of water needs to go under the bridge, and whilst it's all very well to have Nick Smith coming here, they've had 9 years we've had these problems for a while, but it is also good to note that we've been uplifted to medium status in terms of growth, but that's still only 0.73 growth per year. I'm more ambitious than that. I think if we get the infrastructure right, and a lot of other players have to play their part, like Simon Bridges with Tenai and Nongata, the roading network, the infrastructure, the sewerage problems that we're going to have to face. We need a combined effort, and I agree. I mean, we've all sat around and been involved in local
Councillor
body.
Stewart,
Just one other point, Madam Chair. We've sat around and been involved in local body politics for a lot of time, and the major landowners in this town, if it doesn't fit in with their plans, they must be at the table right from day one. The major landowners in this district, and I take your point on that, Madam Chair. So I'll support additional 4, but I also we need to be involved at the entry level, along with the rural and the lakes and Te Tau, at the table when these decisions are made, not at ministerial level, but at committee level or even workshop level, so that we're involved.
Thank you. Thank you. And this is just the start, so thank you. Ms Morrison?
Madam Chair, sorry, could I just, I think it's important I just answer off part of that question there, which was about where does this sit? This clearly sits at the end of the spatial plan process. So councillors, you know, we've drawn some blobs on maps, we put it out as a discussion document with our community. We're now bringing that back together again to go out with a formal draft plan, which will have a formal submission process and hearing. That's the place where everyone has the chance to have their say about where development should occur in our district, and special housing areas are a way of implementing that. So it comes after the spatial plan discussion. So your concern about making sure that the communities were involved and elected members were involved in decision making, that is the process that will take you through that, of which the special housing area would then be identified as the mechanism to deliver it. So that's the running order. So community involvement is still at the foremost, and your decision making is at the foremost of that process.
Thank you. Ms Morrison?
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. I had one question, but I've got another one just based on what JP just said, because it looks like there's quite a bit of work now to do this future development strategy, and then I also saw that there's an infrastructure strategy that needs to be part of the package. And it seems like we're still trying to hit for August. I'm just worried about, are we going to have enough time to go out, given the House will rise mid-20-something of August? And I'm just wondering, have we got enough arms and legs in council, and then enough sort of a strategised process to go out to the community? Because I'm just wondering, if you say we're going to do the spatial plan, it's coming back at the end of August, but then we would have missed the opportunity to put it before Parliament.
Can I just, yes, I think because the Accord, if the Accord doesn't, sign off on an agreement on the Accord doesn't require consultation with the community. So that could be done, I presume, with sufficient time to get it down. Thank you.
So that's an internal, so we'll be doing that alongside, I'm just trying to get the sequencing, because it sounds like there's 2 work streams. One's consultation out, and then internally there'll be a accord. So just wondering.
So the accord is an agreement between council and government through that act, and it sets out the relationship and some of the priority areas to consider. So, and those priorities are, how do you get affordability? How do you bring enough housing to the market? So it is at a high level. So it's almost the MOU or relationship agreement over which, or under which, any special housing areas or any other interventions can be hooked. So that's the timing, and totally agree that that's got a reasonably short time frame and actually a necessary short time frame before the elections to go through. So that travels in one direction. The special housing areas that would then flow would be for post our spatial plan completion. So what we're talking about at the moment is, having taken our feedback from the community on our discussion document, we already have an infrastructure strategy in place. So we already have an infrastructure strategy. It's a requirement under the Local Government Act. So we're now in a process of saying we need to go out with our draft spatial plan, get that community feedback, and start to reflect what are the infrastructural limitations and requirements, and at which point we then have to say, okay, we've finalised our spatial plan, so that'll be later this year. We need to make sure then that our LTP investment is aligned with that, and also our updated infrastructure strategy, which has been the responsibility of Stavros Michaels to complete, is then the summary of all of our asset management plans to support that. So it's making sure all of our different documents, LTP, infrastructure strategy, then align behind our spatial plan. And then of course we can start exploring using the special housing areas as a mechanism to help us move forward more quickly. So that's the sort of the timing. So the first piece is to get our draft spatial plan out for our community to engage with. So that's still looking at the end of August, looking at signing up with the government a housing accord, which just gives us that relationship document on which we can hang a number of future steps, and then that just brings the two processes back together. And then a lot of this will come into the LTP process over the next 12 months.
Thank you for that. Mr. Thomas?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a comment really about the special housing areas. I hope that, and I raise this quite often, I hope that this will have a focus outside of just the urban area, and look at the lakes areas and the rural as well, of course, especially around the lakes areas, around Papakāinga. There are a lot of aspirations of iwi out around Lakes Rotorua especially, I know, but also at Tarawera and the other lakes. There's a lot of very poor quality housing around our lakes, so I think that if we're looking at these sorts of things, I hope that it isn't just confined to the urban area. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. Berryman, Kemp?
Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, maybe just want to talk with some of the words that Councillor Sturt outlined. I think the important, what you brought to the table is exciting stuff. Yeah, and certainly I'm always keen to take that opportunity, but, and I acknowledge your worship that with reduced timeframes there may not be the opportunity to get everyone at the table. However, it is going to be the landowners, it is going to be our community across the entire district who's going to be able to make this happen. So just want to talk with some of those comments. Obviously, I have a particular bent towards the iwi entities. I'm aware Ngāi Tahu and also Ngāti Whātua are heavily involved in these things from a commercial development side, but there are other gains that can be made too, as well as other local developers. Now, but my question is, and it actually gets back to the paper 7.1 under the misconceptions, but there's a bullet point, needed evidence at this stage. Maybe I seek a little bit more guidance from what Ms. Morrison was outlining, because actually, if I read the report, needed evidence at this stage, and that we're going out to the next iteration of the spatial plan that's going to need more evidence. Now we've just pulled in another factor that's going to require more evidence for people to make informed input into the next version of the spatial plan. I'm wondering, is there a process map, or I guess I don't want the opportunity lost due to a lack of evidence, a lack of best practice, that sort of thing.
It's a good question, and I think one of the key elements that we chose to do, and I think it's a tactical one, was to go out with a discussion document that appeared and appropriately appeared to have the open mind. So we've been doing a number of bits of work. We've got some economic analysis, we've got these various growth projections and assumptions there for both commercial and industrial as well as residential. So we've got a large evidence base. A number of submitters, and through their feedback, were sort of saying, well, actually, I can't see that at the moment, and that was a deliberate tactic of ours through our discussion document to keep it at a very high level, keep it very open to say, here's some ideas at this stage. We didn't really want to go out with, we've already commissioned some economic analysis and we think this and this should happen. So we really wanted at this stage almost to have a blank canvas, not quite a blank canvas with some blobs on it, but really keep the discussion quite open at this stage. And that's why this was an informal feedback stage. And so we think this is just as important as some of that economic analysis and some of that evidence that sits behind some of the thinking that's already there. And that will be summarised and made clear into the draft document. So those who crave to see the different population projections, the analysis of how much commercial or industrial land is projected to be required, they will be able to see that either summarised in the draft spatial plan that will come out at the end of August, or will be available on other documents that will sit alongside it. So we'll have the references to our evidence base at the same time. So there is a strong evidence base, we just didn't put it out at that stage, and I suppose that's why we picked it up as a misconception, was that this was our draft spatial plan. No, it's not. And it does not contain all of our evidence. This is a discussion document to get people interested to engage, and I certainly think that's been the positive part of it, is that people have felt that they could input at this stage and provide a differing view without us saying, well, sorry, our economists have already said this. So that's the way we've tactically chosen to run the process, and I hope that makes us in a position where we go out with a stronger draft, which is hopefully better suited to the choices that many landowners have already got as well. The attempts we've made to make sure we've engaged with land trusts has been really important for us. We certainly didn't want to finalise a plan that suggested residential zoning or some sort of zoning rolling across someone's land where we hadn't had a far more informal conversation first. So that's been an important step in this process as well. So hopefully that gives you some reassurance that there is evidence being compiled and it will come through into our draft document, and on that basis it will follow the good practice requirements that should be in place for a spatial plan.
JP, did you want to move on to that discussion document
Yeah,
feedback? Is there anything there that you want to?
Madam Chair, and just not to prolong it, look, the paper there was just to give you the executive summary of the feedback we've received, and I've tried to summarise that as neatly and efficiently as I can on page 15. So those are the high-level takeaways. I did not want in any way to demean the feedback we've had as well. So I've made sure that we circulated this all of the feedback to you, so you could see who has said what and in what detail. Clearly, we're not just going to take those headlines off page 15 and use that as our driver. The team are looking in detail at those submissions and what it means for us in preparing a draft document. So happy to answer any other questions, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Kent.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just in relation to what feedback we've actually received, I note on page 15 you say council's received feedback from 449 people. Well, my question is, then why have we only got 19 written submissions?
Through you, Madam Chair, one of the things we've got is that there's a lot of it's been summarised off things like our Engagement HQ tool. So online we had a number of submissions made, and also submissions did come from groups. So we're talking about the number of people who were there. I think we cite in here about 59 meetings or something like that. I'm just trying to find my reference to it myself. 56 workshops So that was about 602 people. And so, again, some of those people made a group contribution and others went away and just entered stuff on Engagement HQ. So that on our online tool and just made comments there. We might have received one message or 1 point, or they might have made several points in that as well. So that's part of that process.
So have we only received 19 written submissions?
19 submissions in a hard format like that, yes, councillor. 19 written submissions as opposed to people who have used formal comments back to us in a full written format. Others have done it through the meetings, so we've taken notes from meetings. If you'd attended some of the workshops, you would have seen a number of people actually provided their feedback by scribbling all over maps for us. So that was really positive, and often those were group sessions. So there was a map provided to a table, and people would discuss some of the proposals that had been put in the discussion document, and would furiously write and scribble and draw on our plans. So that's been some of that compilation process as well. But when you're saying 19 written ones, yes, that's what we've received.
Well, I have to say, quite honestly, I found the summation document as the results of the feedback from workshops through in online engagement almost impossible to follow. If you look through it, there are comments there like agreeing to something without even specifying what it is that they're agreeing to and so on. And I actually find this basically meaningless as an analysis, and I would ask that in future we actually receive the proper submissions and have a chance to actually see who made the submissions, because that in turn can help us give weight to those submissions.
Thank you. Councillor Gould, then Councillor Hunt.
Chair. Thank you, JP, for your report. I've got 3 questions. One, with resources and staff of the Rotorua-Tait Council for the Housing Accord and Special Housing Areas Act 2013, do we have the resources and staff? And question 2, the vacant land, would we be able to have a quicker turnaround on turning that vacant land into sections for people to build houses on? And number 3, the statistics of 7.2% growth from 2013 to 2023, I believe is too low, because the population figure at 2013 for the Rotorua-Tait Council was 65,300 people, and I believe the figure should be probably somewhere like 10-14%, which means if we get into the 10% category, we will get special attention.
Through Madam Chair, just covering off those 3 questions. I think the first one was around resourcing. Yes, we have adequate resourcing. So Henry and I are sort of liaising with the MB officials around the Accord and what needs to be in it for Rotorua. So that, as I say, it's a high-level relationship agreement at this stage. So that's our first step. And up on the screen still is that idea of the action plan, that we're just making sure that as an organisation we are aligning ourselves around delivering on quite a few different actions across quite a few different areas. Your second question was, will this enable us to get houses built quicker in areas? That's the aim of the Act. That was the aim of the special housing areas identification. So as a mechanism, we're quite positive that that's what we will achieve at the end of this process. So, and as I said, that's our opportunity to implement what comes out of the spatial plan.
Thank you. Councillor Hunt, then Councillor Donaldson.
Thank you. Just a comment, then a question, just in reference to Councillor Sturt's comment about the district plan. Some of those aspects are already out of date because the assumptions on which that district plan was put to the community no longer hold. And I guess the noting on page 16 under the immediate actions, the Papakainga District Plan Review rules, that is going to come to the RMA Policy Committee. And my question for you, JP, is if you could explain the role of the RMA Policy Committee in light of this housing accord, and where that will come to the committee, and then when it will come back to the council, my council colleagues around the table, because I think that explanation may well reassure everybody that there will be ample opportunity to see where we're heading. And that, of course, and on the RMA committee we have Gina Mohi, so we do have Te Tata representation there.
Madam Chair, the RMA Policy Committee is intended to look at district-wide RMA policy work. So it is the committee you have given responsibility to lead the discussions around plan changes and also to undertake any reviews of the district plan that are required. So they are the high-level RMA district-wide policy committee. So what we'll be looking at doing, just as we're doing now, at looking at how our operative district plan has still some minor issues. So we've just gone out with a plan change around noise, just to tidy up some rules there. Any suggestions of how we use a special housing area will be brought back through the RMA committee, so that that committee can recommend to council whether they believe it's the appropriate mechanism to achieve the outcomes we're trying to achieve. So they will be the ones who are recommending to council around whether that's the right approach, or whether we should be using normal plan change requirements to undertake any works from our district plan. So really that committee is quite important. And looking at how we use our district plan, keep the integrity of that district plan, but also looking at how we undertake either the rolling reviews or identifying those areas that need to be changed. So we've had a number of submitters who have raised the issues around the barriers of our current rules to Papakainga development. And so that's become for us an immediate action for us just to take that information, look downstairs within our consenting team at the work they're undertaking and some of the inquiries they're receiving, talk more directly with iwi about some of those comments, and then that will be brought back as a paper to the RMA Policy Committee for them to recommend whether we do need to change the Papakainga rules or not. So that's the process for that one to go through. So RMA Policy Committee is hugely important to ensuring that we have a district plan that meets the requirements of this community and within its growth requirements or its context as well. So hopefully that answers that question.
Thank you. I'm going to take some final questions now. Councillor Donaldson and Councillor Stewart.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, it was just a response and add some further commentary to what Councillor Stewart said regarding the funding for special housing areas. So, I agree with JP that, well, for a start, you need your accord in place before you can get that funding. But also, it dovetails into the LTP, and your 30-year infrastructure strategy needs to go alongside your financial strategy. And it's not free money, it's a loan. And so it goes to debt. And that's why Auckland didn't get truckloads like Tauranga, is because they're at their debt ceiling. So, we need to be looking at our debt headroom as well if we're looking for handouts from the government or loans, interest-free loans from the government for infrastructure for special housing areas. And those growth councils typically have a higher debt to revenue ratio than our self-imposed 175%. So there's all of those considerations have to come into play, and I know Her Worship's had comments from the Minister of Finance about what we should be doing in that area. So there's a lot of decisions to be taken into consideration.
Thank you. Councillor Stewart.
Madam Chair, coming back to the spatial planning, and the report that we got giving us a summation of the feedback, I find it very easy to follow. I actually think it's really cool that you've gone out to the different communities and picked up what are the core issues within those communities, and whether they be urban, whether they be rural, whether they be Hamarana, Mamaku, etc., etc. So I think the real grassroots issues are here. The trick is now to take them forward, and I hear what you're saying, Councillor Hunt, that the DP has the parameters of the DP have changed. However, the infill growth still hasn't occurred. So those are all the issues that have got to come together. I'm not against this, Madam Chair. I think this is a great leveller to the community to be involved at the grassroots level rather than the high level stuff will occur eventually. But the community have got to own it. They come through. I mean, I just think some of the issues they've raised are just amazing, and they will filter through. But we've got to make sure we're involved to bring those issues through. So I thank you for your assurance, JP, that that will occur, that these will not be ignored. But there are, and I take on board what the Deputy Mayor and the Mayor said, this just doesn't stand alone. There are a lot of other jobs and issues, strategies and development proposals that we've got to put in place. Hopefully the spatial plan will bring them all together so that we can go forward into the future with some confidence. So I find this very, very interesting, an interesting read. Issues in communities I didn't think existed exist. So I think it's opened our horizons, and I didn't expect 783 individual written submissions. I think what you've done is summarised them. I love what you've done. You know, I mean, it wouldn't have been easy getting the views of the Hamarana and Lakeside people out that way, and I just say on page 103 I found really interesting. So, no, let's bring it together and move forward. So I'm happy to move the motion, Madam Chair, 2, 3, and I'll second her worship's additional 4.
There was a final question from you, Mr Berriman Kemp, and then I'm going to put that motion. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Just a brief comment then, my question. I go back to 7.2 in the document that you supplied to us that outlines that obviously the spatial plan will be critical in terms of our 30-year infrastructure plan and everything else. I think there's been enough talk on that. My question is, actually, is it a question or is it? My question is, will the impact of the housing accord, will the impact of the increased growth rate, will the impact of some new futurist thinking also be factored into the draft spatial plan that will go out for consultation in August? I'm getting a nod. And my point about that is, for instance, just as a aside, when you talked about Papakainga housing, I think we have an idea of that. However, those of us who watched, I think it's TV's futurist program on new ways of living, one example of housing was shown down in Dunedin, I think it was, that to me looked remarkably like a Pākehā marae, basically. And people were buying into it because it made total and complete sense. So what I'm asking is, with this new injection of a housing accord, new growth rates, what people assume some models are, I'm just hoping that we'll have time by August to make sure that we can feed enough information to them to think of what a future could look like. Does that make sense?
Thank you.
I think the short answer is we're trying to say yes through that process. One of the comments where we did, and a few people commented on it specifically too, is those drivers have changed. We'd had that little page or a couple of pages where we sort of just left them hanging of saying, so climate change is a factor, Auckland growth's a factor, technology change. One of the things that we need to do in the next part of the document was that we got a number of responses, which is, okay, you listed those things, but so what? What does that mean to your assumptions about what's happening? So one of the things that we will be doing in the draft is tying specifically what we think it could mean, those assumptions, to our population growth, to the type of housing people require for the future, all of those sorts of things, and what that means also for the implications around our infrastructure. So yes, we do have to get more specific, but again, with all of these things and anything where you start pointing your nose towards the future, it is a projection or an assumption. So so we will explore those, and hopefully we'll have enough more information this time around for people to say, I agree or I disagree with what you're assuming, and I might have a different perspective on it. So that's certainly what we'll be looking to explore through the draft.
Thank you very much. Thank you, JP. Yes, housing configurations has changed. The family unit has changed as we know it from 20 years ago. There are now a lot of generations starting to live more together, the needs of older women who live longer on their own, all of these sort of things that they do have to be taken into account. We've had sufficient discussion on this item. I am going to put second, third and that additional recommendation there. It's been moved, both of them have been moved. Are you moving, Councillor, Your Worship, are you moving 2, 3 and 4? And Councillor Stewart, you've seconded those? Thank you. So it's been moved 2, 3 and 4. I'll read those out. That the key messages from the community feedback be incorporated in the preparation of the draft spatial plan. 3, that the committee note that a draft document will be prepared by the end of August. And 4, this is the additional recommendation, that the committee recommend to council that it support entering a housing accord with government under the Housing Accords and Special Housing Areas Act 2013. It's been moved by Her Worship the Mayor, seconded by Councillor Stewart. All those in favour, please say aye. Contrary, thank you, carried. Thank you for that, councillors. Sorry, Councillor Stewart. Councillor Kent. Beg your pardon.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just have a question in relation to the draft document. Is there going to be an opportunity for us to review this draft document and discuss it at a workshop prior to, or are we just going to get a rehash of the existing document?
I think because of the interest that's been shown this morning, and obviously because we're all concerned. I mean, housing is a big issue right throughout the country, and we're wanting to get onto it. So I think, as I heard you say, indicate before, Your Worship, that a workshop possibly would be called. Is that correct? Because I think it's really necessary. We all want to be informed at the same level as everybody else around the table. So.
Madam Chair, we had intended to bring back to you a draft document. Now, I was intending to bring that back to a committee for you to recommend to council so we could go out for consultation. But if you believe a workshop's important, I think that gives us a chance to make sure that you've road tested a draft and are confident that it's saying the right things to go out to our community. So I'll build that into our process in August.
Yes, thank you, JP, because it does have to reflect the thinking around the table. Thank you for that. Mr. Thomas, you had something. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Look, just as we finish this conversation around the spatial plan discussion documents, I'd just like to thank staff on behalf of the Lakes communities for the stupendous effort they made to come out and visit all our communities and engage with them. This is the first time that this has really happened for our communities, and they've really really appreciated it. As the Mayor commented, we got a glowing thanks from the Rotorua-Tait Community Association for having gone out there, and I do know all our communities really appreciated the effort they've put into and are looking forward to more engagement along the same lines.
Thank you, Mr. Thomas. I think it's actually important that that the views that come from the rural and indeed the Lakes community, you're not just concerned with your own areas, that you also have views around Rotorua urban as well, and it's good that we get that cross-fertilisation of ideas coming through as well, so thank you. And you're quite right, there's been a lot of effort that's gone into making sure that the voices of the Lakes and the rural people are heard as well. Thank you for that. Recommendation 2, the Class 4 Gambling and Board Venue Policy Deliberations. I'd like to have a mover and a seconder, please, that we receive that report. Thank you, Councillor Gould. Thank you, Mr. Thomas. Beg your pardon, yes. So you'd like to just note that you've withdrawn from the table for this agenda item. Thank you, Councillor. So noted, Councillor Maxwell. Thank you for that prompt, Councillor Gould. It's been moved and seconded that the report Class 4 Gambling and Board Venue Policy Deliberations been received. It's been moved and seconded. All those in favour that we receive the report, please say aye. Contrary, thank you, carried. This is yours too, JP, I think. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Councillors, I've just got a couple of slides I wouldn't mind putting up, which for me just summarise the key issues we've tried to traverse in this paper and a revised policy. And I just think it's important just to step through those, and it might just guide some of the conversation I'm sure you will have. So councillors,
JP, just before you start, I'm sorry, I just wondered if I could also call for a mover and a seconder because of the hearings, the minutes of the hearings, before we actually get on to that would be, so just to keep it nice and clear. Could I have, thank you, Your Worship, that's for a mover and a seconder to adopt the minutes, and this was the minutes of the Strategy, Policy and Finance Committee hearing, re the Class 4 gambling and board venue policy held on the 13th of June 2017 be adopted as a true and correct record. Those were the minutes of the hearing, so we'll get that out of the way. So Mayor Chadwick has moved and Councillor Kent has seconded. So could I have a so I'll put that motion. All those in favour, please say aye. Contrary, thank you. Thank you. Sorry for the interruption, JP.
So, councillors, Carol will just pop that back up. I've just tried to pick up on a couple of key points in it, and I'll just slowly go through these. So, we've proposed a different policy position to the one that had gone out for consultation. So, councillors, I think we had a cap and relocation opportunities in our last policy, and it was really a continuation of the one before that. So it was our status quo was a cap of 380 and allowed relocations, but the intention was to gradually over time bring down those numbers. The policy that we put out for community consultation started to put in place the sinking lid. So the view there was that we had harm being produced, so the social impact assessment and also the feedback from our community survey was quite strong in saying we believe these machines are causing harm in our community, and that is what led to the gradual decrease across those. However, during the submission process we had a number of different views coming to the fore, and those were about the importance of these machines to some businesses. They're not the core of a business, they're an addition to a business, and the concerns that reducing the machines so that gradual decline would have a serious impact on the viability, the saleability and the relocatability of some of those businesses. So that was strongly messaged through at that point. There was also a number of community groups who talked about what they saw as the value of the money being recycled back into our community. And so we had a number of groups who were saying, well, where will that money come from if it's not available through this source? So those are the two important questions, and probably the third bullet point there is the one I've just alluded to, which is also our success of our current policy. So we've had a number of a policy in place for quite a few years, and it's very, very slowly seen the reduction in machines. And really the biggest issue there is that people try to relocate their machines, and the fear there was that we would create a situation where people would not move. So we end up with a sort of a behaviour to counter our policy direction. So so what we've done, and it's my last bullet point there, is to put on the table to you a sort of a third way, which is try to address some of the issues that had been identified by the two ends of the submission groupings, and come up with sort of a third way. So again, potentially not making everyone happy, but in both options that we've had previously, some group would be disappointed with the outcome, either a business, community groups from a funding perspective, or those who have very honestly talked about the harm created by problem gambling. So that's been sort of the position we've been in thinking about, is there another way of doing this? So councillors, probably one of the strong messages we got through was this: we'd taken a district-wide approach. So a number of submitters honed in on a question around the CBD as a place where there exists a large number of bars and has a high visibility in the way of CCTV and sort of, I suppose, regulation across the CBD area versus suburban localities which are putting gambling machines close to those who potentially are vulnerable, with very little visibility. So it's that ability to access it within your suburb, and particularly if there's problems, that makes it quite an easy source for people. So what's been proposed here is really a case of saying, okay, we've picked up on that message quite strongly, so in our policy we're now saying let's break our district up into 2 zones as opposed to a district-wide approach, and say there's a CBD view and there's a suburban view. So the idea being there that you're able to relocate across the city if you're a bar with gambling machines, but you're not able to relocate into the suburbs, or if you're in the suburbs you're not allowed to relocate across the suburbs. So you could relocate back to the city, but that would be the only outcome. So that's this way of sort of managing what is seen as that harm, or more likely harm, of those machines being accessible within the suburban areas. So so that leads on to the last bullet point there, which is the question around caps, and caps creating a behaviour then that works against that policy objective. So if we're trying to achieve a movement to the CBD and out of the suburbs, then does a cap then prevent the outcomes that you're trying to achieve? So that's really where we get to the second issue, which is the sinking lid or a cap. So it's taken many years for us to get down to 382 machines within our district. So that's above what has been the cap in our policy for a number of years, which was 380. So there I've just highlighted that progress has been slow, and really one of the concerns that was raised by a number of submitters is to say, understand what you're trying to achieve, but actually the only person who loses is the person who moves first. So as you start taking a cap down, or you start that progress down to a cap, or the only option then is to adhere to a sinking lid, which means everyone loses who moves. So there was a real concern around that fairness. So one of these things about saying we've got a desire to move out of the suburbs is to say, if you then impose a cap below our current level, even if there was the opportunity to relocate back to town, they would prefer not to move because the machines would then be lost. So it's that first move or lose. So that's the issue here about what is our policy objective, and have we created in setting a cap or imposing a sinking lid the risk that we won't get the outcomes of moving out of the suburbs by putting those in place, and I believe that's what we'll see. So that's why we've proposed to actually lift the cap to 382. So even if we kept a cap in the existing level of 380, that, and I'll use an example, the first suburban bar that has gambling machines who says, I've got to move out of my premise because my lease is up, actually I'd like to move back to town, in that movement, that first person who did that would lose 2 machines. So, and that's why we'll end up with probably a negative policy outcome where they would sit there and go, actually, if I can milk another year out of my suburban location, I'll wait because I want someone else to lose their machines in the move back to the CBD. So this is why we sort of said, look, what are we trying to achieve as our overall goal? And let's focus on that. So that's why we've sort of taken that sort of line. You can agree or disagree with that logic, because a number of people sort of said it's less about the number of machines, it's more so the issue around the venues, the number of venues and the number of venue locations. So by keeping the current level, we've actually allowed the machines to move between venues, but also move back to the CBD without a loss on its way. So that's the kind of the logic that's led to this proposal in front of you. So councillors, that's probably the core of our thinking in providing an alternative policy. Happy to answer any questions to the best of my ability.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, JP. Councillor Stewart, then Councillor Kent.
I unfortunately wasn't here to hear the hearings, but have read the basis of the submissions, and I think what is before council today is applies the fairness measure. And I think it's fair to machine owners. I think it's fair to those who recognise that gambling does have harmful aspects, but it's also fair to those who reap the benefits as well. So I think what we've come up with is a compromise. We're signalling to the community we want these eventually, over time, out of the suburbs, into the CBD. Of course, if there isn't a venue within the CBD that wants to take those machines, of course their licence collapses. So there's a two-edged sword to that as well. I've got no questions. I think it's been considered reasonably, taken all views into account, and I think what's come forward, for the reasons that JP said about the 382, I support, but I'm happy to listen to the debate.
Thank you, Councillor Stewart. Councillor Kent.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I find it hard to believe that any business would fail to relocate on the basis that they were going to give up 2 pokie machines. Obviously, they would relocate their business based on a business case, and the number of machines, 2 machines, is hardly going to make a significant difference. So I question the necessity to increase the cap from its current level, particularly when you could actually put into the policy that if an existing premises was relocating, they could relocate provided the number of machines did not increase. So that they could retain the existing. However, my main issue is on page 41, where we state in the policy that the policy does not affect any Class 4 gambling venue established on or before the 17th of October 2001. So in other words, they can do what they like, they can increase their numbers, they're not even subjected to this policy?
Councillor, no, it doesn't give them carte blanche, so they're still bound by this rules. My understanding of that is it doesn't. Yeah,
That's only for the number of machines, isn't it?
yeah, but they can't. My understanding, they're still bound by the
Gambling policy.
by gambling policy and the number of machines per, the revenue turnover, all those kind of rules still apply. I'm looking up at Rosemary in the back there, who's just nodding towards me. I just wonder if that's a specific question she can just answer off for me. But my understanding is it doesn't give them a total exit out of the framework.
So my understanding is that when our policy was established, there were already grandparenting clauses for businesses already with their numbers. So DIA also has rules they have to comply with. So they can't increase their numbers. They have set numbers, it's a maximum that they can have. So they can't actually increase, and there's specific rules if they were if 2 businesses were coming together and things like that. So they can't actually overall increase their numbers.
But what is the reason for excluding gambling venues from this policy?
Basically most of them have the maximum that they are allowed to have. They're not excluded. It's just that we have to cover the grandparenting clause of what they had at the time the policy came into existence.
Are you making it just explicit then? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, my understanding, and again, Councillor, sorry, we probably need to check with our legal counsel on this one, or our policy advisor who created this. My understanding is that it's a continuation of almost identification that they had an existing use right, which has to be carried through in each of these policies. So we might have had a venue X, who prior to 2001 had 20 machines. They are able to keep their 20 machines, and through this process they've been able to keep their 20 machines. If they move, they trip into that next situation. But if they were there prior to 2001, we've still got to acknowledge that they have those existing use rights. So you're saying they're excluded? Yes, they are, and it's almost that continuation of that. That's my understanding of it. But we could check that. Again, this is a recommendation to council, so I can take any specific questions that we have where we've probably not adequately answered the question and make sure we're covering that off before you ratify this at council.
Can I just suggest, Madam Chair, then that should be investigated just to make sure we've got it right.
Thank you. Councillor Gould and Mr Berryman Kemp.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, JP, for your report. On page 18 of our document today, you've got 5 recommendations for the Policy Act. My questions are around some of those. 1, what do you class as CBD? 2, is Trade Central included in the CBD? 3, have you made any provision of any club moving premises like outside the CBD, like the Rotorua Club or the CT Club? Because in some of those cases it could be quite important that they are given the opportunity, if situations arise, that they have to move premises.
I just wondered, Councillor Gould, did you actually see the maps at the back there that stipulated and identified the boundaries for the what we classify as CBD for the purposes of this report? Might have answered one of your questions then.
Councillor, just Trade Central was involved. Basically what this zone is we've actually picked up, I think it's inner city zone 1, 2 and 3 from the district plan, so we wanted to make sure we adhered to our best definition of what we consider to be the core CBD. So that's the basis of identifying that area. So that you can see there it does include the lakefront because that was part of our zone 1, 2 and 3 of inner city. So this is a district plan type map. Your reference to the CT Club, the CT Club is in the suburbs. So if they were to relocate, they could not relocate within the suburbs. They would have to relocate into the CBD if they wanted to take their machines. So there is a limitation of the machines. So you know the policy we've taken here is to say that it's the machines in the suburbs which are the issue. So they could not move 2 doors down the road. They would then have to forfeit their machines. So there is now those machines would be available to be picked up in the CBD. Or they could relocate to the CBD. So the intention here is to bring the machines into the CBD where they have that higher visibility and accesses. You need to go to town to access these machines. The only limitation within the inner city, and you made references to the bullet points we have on page 18, which was also that sensitive areas being identified. So again, there's some specific requirements around where they could go within the CBD as well. Policy consistency-wise, councillors, you know, this is part of that thinking again about how we took our psychoactive substances policy. So the appropriate place was in the CBD, away from sensitive sites, and with a high level of visibility.
Thank you. Mr Berryman Kemp.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have one comment and 3 questions, and hopefully won't be too short. First of all, the comment, whilst I appreciate the explanation, I'm struggling with how we could have started with a preferred option, which is adopt a sinking lid and no relocations, and now we're increasing the cap and allowing relocations. Having said that, I understand the rationale behind the relocation from suburbs to CBD, so I get that bit. My 3 questions are, and I'll say all 3 and then go through each one. Number 1, how does this revised recommendation actually reduce harm? My second question is, what are the actual numbers? Because I'm unclear what the actual value of community funding that may or may not get lost actually is. I'm unclear as to what the actual business impact may or may not be. And my third question is, what is the message we send if we approve this recommendation, given the last time this came to us, the community message sent to the council was no. So 3 questions. Number 1, how does this reduce harm? Number 2, what are the actual numbers to make an informed decision? And number 3, what's the message we send if we go down this route?
The first one relates to that feedback we received that sometimes there was the comments made that the number of machines was not the driver in itself, it was the number of venues, and the other one was that the most significant harm was seen as being in the suburban areas. So that was the sort of the question around that space. Now the other part of it is if you allow the relocations and the movement towards the CBD, and I think Councillor Sturt touched on it, there's also the opportunity then for machines if they're not, if a bar does not pick up from a suburban area and open within the CBD, there is the opportunity then that those machines are available based on, and again there's a bunch of rules around revenue and how much of a proportion of the revenue that they could, or some could be picked up within an existing venue. So there's an opportunity to see a consolidation in a smaller number of venues over time, with either the relocation from the suburbs to the city or a decrease in the number of venues. So the machines are taken in that way. So that, whether that affects the numbers. Now, we had those submissions from some groups. Again, this is the judgment that you around this table need to make about their comment saying, look, the harm was not proportional to the number of machines. So there was, I'm trying to remember the submitter, but they were taking the view it's the venues and the venue locations are more of an impact than the number of machines. So that's the first piece. Your comment around the economic impact on individual businesses of loss of machines. Look, that's a business by business discussion, and I think the fundamental there is that the intention of the current policy is a venue cannot derive the majority of its income. You know, there's these percentages of income derived from machines versus it operating as a normal bar or a club. So they become a limiting factor economically. The comment made by Councillor Kent about, will 2 machines really make a difference? Probably not, but it might as well. And again, that's the economics of each individual business, but there is limits and thresholds about how many machines and how much of a proportion that can fit within there. I suppose what we were reflecting back is that we had a number of business submitters who were taking the view that if we had to relocate and we lost our machines, it would make our business not viable and therefore we wouldn't continue. So again, that's a business by business decision, but that's what they presented to us. So there's no specific analysis of that. And the third question, I probably can't remember what that third one was.
My third question, and that may not just be for you, JP, but the third question is, if we proceed with what I think the recommendation is to go through, what is the message this council sends to our community, not the venue owners, not those who derive benefit from the distributions of the machines, but to our community, when I think it might have been 82% of the community said they want less machines.
Point of order, Madam Chair.
That may be a council question rather than a...
Sorry, do you have a point of order?
I did. That is not a question to put to a council officer. A council officer is reflecting our policy that we're establishing here today. So it is what is our message we have to decide as elected officials if we pass this.
Yeah, thank you, Your Worship. Thank you for those questions. There are a number of councillors that wish to speak. Ms Morrison.
Madam Chair, where do I start? I'm a great advocate for evidence-based decision making, and we've had, this has been going on for a while, and I'm disappointed I was away during the submissions, but I've read them. And we've had the research from APR, and we've had a draft policy, and we've had this process as well. And, you know, and we've had very good engagement from groups with a specific business or benefit interest as of late in the changes. And I suppose the thing I would say is, you know, let's not forget the previous comments that 88% of the population said they wanted it. them reduced. So my question was, we've talked about the CBD, movement into the CBD, and I agree with that. And you talked about the venues, the number of venues is actually the issue. I can't see in here how we've covered off an opportunity for a business to split, so to move out from the suburbs in and split into two different sites in the CBD. Have we covered that off so that can't happen? So what we're trying to do is a sinking lid on venues as well. How do we?
You're right, that doesn't close off or
Yeah.
preclude that. So
that
you're right,
could be
a
a
very
kind of-
large, I suppose, club or bar in a suburban area could move to town and could open in a much smaller footprint and actually open two. Yeah.
Or three,
So,
or however
so you're
many.
right. So I suppose the difficulty with that is how we manage that. Those machines would then be available under the cap. So depending on people's revenue, another bar could pick them up. So yes, it might go into another one, which is an existing venue, but you're right, it could be split between two, as an example. So that's not precluded through this process. And I don't.
would suggest perhaps we look at that, because that, if we're saying that actually where they're located and the number of venues is actually as significant as the number of machines, that's something I think we could look at, to maybe sinking lid on the venues. I don't know, but I'd like to see that modelled out.
Yes.
It's 18 machines. So even if someone comes from the suburbs and say it was the club at the racecourse, they couldn't uplift any of the machines because they're at their ceiling. So the venues are controlled by the number of machines they have. And most of them within the CBD, oh, mind you, the racecourse is outside the CBD, but most of them within the CBD have 9 machines. So that was my point of order.
So it could be an additional site then.
Yeah, so the point Anna's making is quite right. We're not, by not having a reduction in the cap, we're not actually going to reduce the venues, and I think that was Rob's point as well. So,
Thank you.
The other point I had was, I just looked up the definition of community facility, and I'm just conscious that we're trying to revitalise and regenerate our CBD, and there has been of late quite a number of after-school programs like the DNA Club and the Children's Art House. New PTEs come into the CBD, Toi Ohomai have got a site, so, and that definition doesn't cover off education, and I just think if we're sort of, I'm not sure if we're covering off that educational harm piece, and sort of having them close to young children, and as currently stated in our definition, I'm just sort of worried about that.
I think it does include schools, because certainly Rotorua Primary was an issue that was raised, and it was around a technical how it was measured since Rotorua Primary, so I consider schools and education facilities and library are certainly considered sensitive sites.
And the definition doesn't include it's not wide enough to say educational facilities, it just says community use. There's PTEs, there's lots of other kind of quite alternative education facilities that aren't schools that are now moving into the CBD, and I just want to make sure we've covered off any harm through that.
I could certainly relook at that definition.
It's defined in the district plan.
Thank you, Ms Morrison. Councillor Hunt.
Are you open for comments now? Or
Yes. Comments and yes.
Okay. I think our previous policy, while on the surface appeared stronger, it actually achieved very little. So that's probably the starting place for me. We put a lot of effort into it when we previously came out, and we thought we were going to make some great runs on the board, and actually we really achieved very little in that. The council's roles, it's a challenge, and it comes back to the message we're sending our community. We're trying to balance the effects from a legal activity. This is a central government issue of whether it's legal and where it's legal. That's not our issue, and yet we're in the invidious situation of having to make comments and put a policy around that. And that's a challenge, because we're having to balance both of those. I think for me, the 382 cap is a pragmatic response, and it actually covers off the point Councillor Kent raised of those who are exempt before 2001. Now, if we leave it at 380, and there is a movement, if you're exempt, then actually it's not going to affect you, it's going to affect the others. So by accepting this is what we've got 382 machines in our community. Half of them are in venues in the city, 13, and another 13 are in the suburbs. So we would rather more of them were in the city. There are some operators who have more than the 9 cap, who would be able to absorb some should they wish to grow their business, but many are at their cap. So I see this as a pragmatic response that creates a level playing field for all. I know that the community is deeply concerned about the harm from gambling. I don't think anybody who has read the submissions or attended the hearings is not aware of this concern. But we have to make a policy based on this legal activity. And I think under the circumstances, what we have achieved here is fair, and I believe it's better than what we had in our previous policy. And I'm pleased that we came back from the 2 options we had, which were deeply polarising in our community, with something that has acknowledged and tried to find a way through that will set us on a path to reduce the impact in our suburbs that these machines have for those communities that spoke so eloquently about that issue. So I hope that that's what happens in this policy, and when it comes up for review in the next 5 years, I guess we'll see whether we have made any inroads there. So I am in support of where we've arrived at with this policy, admitting and acknowledging it's not an easy decision, and it's certainly not a popular one.
Thank you, Councillor Hunt. Your Worship?
Yes, I support the sentiments that Councillor Hunt's put forward. I do believe that representatives needed to be at the hearings because we got a very balanced view, I think, of our community. And even when you come from a public health background, you're quite justified in asking, are we making a difference? I believe our message as politicians is very clear that this is a type of gambling we don't want in the suburbs, full stop. And it may last until the business is no longer viable. And that has been my worry. It's harder to watch those with a problem gambling affliction out in suburbs and community bars that are keeping that business afloat than when it is in co-located into the CBD, where people are more likely to deal with a problem that's very manifest before their eyes in a high tourism destination. So I don't split hairs over the 382, 380, but I do think our message is that it's not an activity that we want to see in our suburbs, and it's one that fits better in a tourism destination, whether you like it or not, and I don't like it, but it fits better in the CBD as part of our revitalisation. And I think the big problem was in 1987, when we allowed these machines into the country without any policy parameters around it at all. And there's been subsequent efforts in the House to try to now put the cat back into the bag, and it's impossible. That was when the decision was made, and we've been left to deal with it as communities ever since. So that's something that we're trying to find a pragmatic middle line solution to. I respect that officers have come back, and I believe this does reflect what we heard during the submission process, which was quite a balance. So I will support this. And I just want to finish with a great quote from Bishop Manu Bennett. When we first talked to him about the gambling policy in 1999, he said, "It's tainted money, but it tain't enough." And I think that really sums up that we know that it's of benefit to our community when it's dispersed to community beneficiaries and our sports clubs and what we heard at the submissions. But we know it has a dark side for people that cannot cope with the addiction of gambling. So I think we've made a balance here. I, like Councillor Hunt, think if we look at it in 5 years' time, what are we going to see? And that's what we should be asking ourselves when we can influence a policy that has an impact on our district. I hope it's no longer an activity out in the suburbs. So I think we have made a gain, even though it doesn't look to be a major step. It certainly is a reflection of what we heard. I'll be supporting the recommendation.
Thank you, Your Worship. Councillor Donaldson, then Mr Thomas.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think there was immense value in attending the hearings, and even at this late stage, I would recommend anyone who wasn't here to have a look at them online to get a better understanding of where we're going with this. And I acknowledge Mr Thomas bravely put off another engagement to retain a quorum and stay behind, so I thank him for that. There's nothing like putting out a strident or a zealous policy to engage lots of feedback, and all of the submissions, on no matter which side of the fence they sat, were really good, heartfelt, quality submissions, I felt. All the submitters spoke really well to the topic, and I think where we have landed is a balanced approach, both from a harm minimisation and from a destination management point of view. I was impressed by, in particular, submissions such as those from Reg Hennessy, who's been in this city in business for a long time, and pointed out that there are really only two premises in the CBD that are vibrant and add vibrancy to the nightlife of the city, in his view, being his one and the Pig and Whistle. One chooses to have machines, one doesn't. But where we've got to with the proposed policy, which I fully support, is that the way our visitor economy is going, a new player could come to town and set up new premises, buy up some of those small machine licences, and they're all based in low decile suburbs. They're not in your Linmores or your Springfields or Kawaha Point. Buy up some of those and relocate to one facility in the CBD. So that enables, this policy enables that. Look, I was also equally moved by the submitters such as Riding for Disabled and Hospice, who provided a balance to those who poured out heartfelt stories of damage to whānau and the Problem Gambling Foundation themselves. Particularly interested, enlightened by the submission from the Rotorua Sports Club, who downloaded the Minister of Internal Affairs' own statement from the DIA website, which shows that the government has basically backed off from funding these not-for-profits, these community groups that do so much good work, such as RDA and Hospice, who said they would be really adversely impacted in terms of survival with the proposed policy and cuts to their funding. And pretty much the government has acknowledged that gaming machines are a viable means of funding these organisations. And I think the other thing we learnt from the korero at the submissions was that, and I think Councillor Kent observed on this, is we were shown the graphs of how machines have reduced over time, and that hasn't seen a corresponding reduction in harm. So it doesn't necessarily equate that less machines equals less harm. It's where the machines are, and I think this policy takes account of that. And so with those few comments, I fully support where we've landed with the policy.
Thank you, Councillor Donaldson. Moving on, Mr Thomas, and then Councillor Tapsell.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As the previous two speakers have started with the submissions, I will as well. And I did enjoy being able to hear the points of view put forward. I have to say that we heard many wonderful recountings of what community organisations do with the money they receive from these gambling machines and the good they do in our community. And they also expressed their fear about losing funding. However, for me, listening to it all, I never got a connection. No one actually made the connection, the actual physical connection, between a reduction in the number of machines, especially given how slowly it's been happening, and a loss of income for them. They had a fear they would lose income, but there was no presentation that actually made that gave evidence that that would happen. I was really impressed with the evidence from the Problem Gambling Foundation. When they came to us with facts, figures, and showed us evidence-based discussions around the proposals. So I'm inclined to go with their point of view that we do need to reduce the number of machines in Rotorua. We are higher than the national average. And I think with this proposal that we've got before us, in actual fact, the only part I can support is the relocation of machines from suburban to urban areas. I can't support the relocation of machines within urban areas. I don't see that that is going to reduce the number of machines or improve the problems around gambling. I'm also disappointed that we're maintaining a cap at the same level. I really feel that we've had a strong indication from our community at large that they want to see machines reduced, and I would hope that we could actually be putting out that message, even if we can't put it as part of the decision we make, that we do put out that our objective is to reduce machines, and it is to reduce machines to such and such a level. So I can't support this recommendation, and I do hope that we could perhaps amend it to reflect more what our communities want.
Thank you. Thank you for those views, and I think they are shared by a number of people around the table as well. I'm going to carry on with with those who wish to speak. Councillor Tapsell, then Mr. Councillor Kumar.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Through you. Look, I'm really disappointed that we haven't taken a harder stance on what's hurting our community, because our community, our families, lose $65,000 a day to pokie machines. So while it's clear that we can't get rid of pokie machines altogether, I think that we should have taken a harder stance. And like Mr. Thomas has mentioned, we do get the counterbalance argument from the sports teams, from the non-profit organisations who are concerned that they're going to lose a money stream. But this is us focusing on the harm, not the money stream. And as evidenced in Mr. Thomas's comments, there's no clear connection between that. So I do also support what Ms. Morrison has brought up as well, about there should have been something in there about sinking lids on venues. We haven't been strong enough there. And I would also like us to add into the district plan, I believe it's part 19, about the education facilities and making sure that's broad enough. Thanks, JP. Broad enough to actually include the contemporary education facilities that we have now. So, thank you. So, as Mayor Chadwick has mentioned, it's actually my uncle, Manu Bennett, who said that. And I guess in response to that, I want to say that, well, we're helping the community, but we're not helping them enough. So I look forward to the changes that this will make, but I look forward to it knowing that we'll be looking at it with very hard critique on how we can improve it in future, because I do believe we could have done a lot more with this. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Tapsell. I echo your sentiments. Councillor Kumar.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Rosemary and JP, for yours and some wonderful submissions today. I just want to use an anecdote with regards to the sinking policy or the closing of some of the outlets. and that's to reflect on what the liquor industry is doing, and that is trying to close down the off licenses, but at the same time allowing more other businesses to open. So is that really reducing alcohol harm or the use of more alcohol? In the same way, if we move away from the suburbs, which is reflective because of the schools and the families' access to there, does it, in the Rotorua sense of point, affect isolated towns like Rotorua and Nongataha because of the distances? I fully also empathize with fellow councillor Tanya Tepsel as well. We need to make a hard stance if we're going to make it. Let's draw a line in the sand if we're going to do that. Even though the recommendations are good, I support Tanya in the fact that we need to be tougher on some of the stances that we try to put. We always try to do a real balance. What if the moratorium opens and we end up with a casino? Are most of the smaller businesses going to survive that have the casino, the poke machines? We are a tourist town. We're only waiting for the moratorium to open. So when that does open, there's going to be a lot more machines. We might end up with one casino or two casinos further down the track. If we're going to make some changes, let's make some real changes now. That's what I'm saying. I probably might not have the solution for it, but I think we need to be all on a very good tangent over here and a wavelength that says, hey, look, we are serious about reducing the number of sinking lid policy could take forever. One in the suburb probably might never sold, or will just pass the papers back to the business and it's never going to happen. But at the same time, how are we going to decide that we will shut the business down for what they paid lots of goodwill for? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Kumar. Mrs. Trumper? Thank you. Shirley?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm probably going to look at it from a grandparenting perspective. As a farmer, we are well versed in grandparenting rules, and our grandparenting rules sit with our property. They don't actually sit with us. So my question is, does the grandparenting rule sit with the licensee or with the premises? Because if you had the premises that have got the 18 machines and they move into the city and it is sitting with the premises, then you have the ability to actually reduce and have a sinking lid. I work with people with financial difficulties, and gambling affects the children and how I have to find food for them. And so I am really strongly against the no sinking lid policy. And I think if there was a way around searching the grandparenting rules, that you can actually introduce a sinking lid if they do move into the city, and then that would cover off Ms. Morrison's concern where they can split, that they can, or you set the limit that they can only move with 15, because it states in here that the council have the ability to set the number of gambling machines. So it can be reduced, and I think that that's a really simple matter. As for the organisations that rely on the funding, there are a number of facilities out there in the country that they can apply for funding, and while the likes of Mr. Hennessy, who I used to work for when he was the proprietor of the Waitapu Tavern, he's a very good speaker on what is right for the district, but he's only one person. Councillor Kumar has mentioned Rotorua, and I was going to ask, that was one of my questions, where does Rotorua fit into the suburb central city part? If you know, because we've got to be careful, they've got 5 machines out there, and we need to be very mindful that we've got to look outside. It's not just Rotorua city versus a suburb, because Rotorua also has a machine. So I'm sorry, I can't support it as it is, but I think that it is obviously all dependent on the grandparenting rule and what we can move and do around that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mrs. Trumpet. Yes. Did you want to comment on something there that you heard, JP?
Madam Chair, it's just again remembering that the Act actually prescribes our mechanisms here, so we are quite limited. So if we go back to the discussion around whether there's support or not support about relocations from the suburbs to the city, if you enable those relocations, there's still a situation, if you then tie that to a cap reduction, the first business that moves will lose. That's the only, you don't lose a percentage, you don't lose one of your machines, you don't lose two of your machines. If we take a cap and we say it's 300 or 250 or 360, the first suburban mover who can't relocate in the suburbs will also lose all of their machines in a move back to the city, because that's the only mechanism to achieve your cap. So that's the problem with a policy mechanism that says you've got a cap because you're seeking to reduce machines, and the only way for us to pick up a reduction towards that cap, and the only one that's prescribed in legislation, is that when they move, they lose. So this is the problem with trying to seek a movement from the suburbs to the CBD. So that's we've taken that stance. But if you tie that then to a cap that's lower than our current level, as I've said, and we've seen it sort of in the behaviour now, people don't want to move. So if they're in the suburb currently and we have a cap, they will try and stay where they are, and so we won't achieve an outcome. So that's why we've tried to say, because it's such a blunt mechanism, why it's not there. So that's our difficulty in this situation.
Thank you. Councillor Kent, then Councillor Donaldson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Firstly, I just addressed two sort of minor cosmetic issues. A request that all the bullet points just be replaced with proper paragraph numbering and sub-paragraph numbering, which would make it much easier to refer to. And secondly, the issue of educational facilities that's been raised is actually covered on page 40, where it says no closer than any school, early childhood centre, kindergarten, place of worship, or other community facility. So I think that is probably wide enough already. Moving on from that, the graph that Councillor Donaldson referred to actually showed quite clearly that the reduction in number of machines has not reduced the dollar spent on machines dramatically by anywhere near the same amount, which very clearly says to me that we can reduce the number of machines without impacting on the flow-on effect to communities that rely on it. Certainly not a significant effect, and that was the most enlightening graph that I think I saw in the whole hearings, and I think it was from the Problem Gambling Society. So that says to me very clearly that we can reduce machine numbers without impacting on the flow-on effect to communities, organisations that need the funding. So we are then left with an issue, which is we want to move gambling venues out of the suburbs into the CBD, but we also want to reduce the number of gambling machines, and the two seem to be at conflict, so why don't we have different rules for the two? We state, for example, that you are permitted to relocate from outside of the CBD into the CBD, retaining your existing machine numbers. That then encourages them to move into the CBD without impacting on the cap levels. The cap level should be if a venue closes, we don't want another one opening. So I would prefer to see the cap brought right down to say about 350, but applicable only to new venues. If a venue closes, it's gone. If you're a venue outside of the CBD, you can relocate and retain your machines, and we've achieved the objective we're after. So I think with a bit of redrafting, we can actually achieve what we're all trying to say here.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for those suggestions. Councillor Kent, Councillor Donaldson, then Councillor Stewart.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Look, I'll move point 3 and perhaps add a point 4 because I hear what councillors are saying. My concern with what Councillor Kent's just said is that it was also raised by a number that a lot of the venues in town are in less than salubrious locations, and so if we implement that type of policy, then we're not going to get an improvement, or if people fall out with their landlord, they can't move. So, you know, we're not managing the destination and improving the standard of these venues if we implement that. But what I note is, and it's on page 19, that the Act requires that we review this policy every 3 years, and here we are doing it after 6 years. And so I think point 4 needs to be is that Rotorua Lakes Council review this policy, and I'm 3 years down the track, and let's see what movement we do get out of the suburbs into the inner city, improvement in inner city. I still feel that it is a balanced approach, but I do think we need to stick to that 3-year review so that we can keep our finger on the pulse of how effective the policy is being, and just see what the changes are. I mean, also in supporting this policy, this is not the only form of gambling that's in your face out there. You know, you've got Lotto app rings the bell and tells you that there's a big pot at stake, and you can go online and you can, you know, everyone's using digital technology these days, or so many more people are. And so there are a myriad of other forms of gambling out there that are tempting people. This is just one. So look, that's my final thoughts on the matter, but I do think we need to stick to that 3-year review, see how things are tracking.
Thank you, Councillor Donaldson. Well, I suppose we could do, as you say, look at the fourth point that you've put up there, or we can take a vote on it and see how it lies. That's the other thing as well. Councillor Stewart.
Yeah. Getting the Balancing Act, as I opened up with, is the big thing. I mean, I personally don't want to create gambling bans in the CBD either. You know, for example, if they wanted to relocate, someone said this policy allows the absorption of those machines into another venue. But if that venue's already got a cap of 18, they can't be absorbed, so they're going to lose out anyway, unless they create another venue within the CBD. Do we really want our streets in the CBD loaded up with a gambling venue in each and every one of them? And the other thing you brought up, Councillor Donaldson, sports betting's huge funder of sport now through the TAB. So I think leave it as we've got it. I agree with the sentiment around the table. I would like to see less machines. I think the cap is going to naturally occur because all the venues, like the one at the racecourse, the one at the TAB in Erawera Street and down at the Turf Bar, they're already at their maximum number of machines anyway. So if Malfoy's collapses in West End, who are they going to amalgamate with? That's what I needed to know before we got to this. But it's a balancing thing. I mean, and you can't, you know, I mean, we can come down hard. I hear what you're saying, Councillor Tapsell, but those people who have those venues have also contributed hugely to sporting groups, to people who are terminally ill, all sorts of, it's just not one thing. And yes, that some people see that money as being tainted, but a lot of young tamariki are benefiting from it in education and sport and recreation and all those sort of things. I think it's a matter of getting a balancing act. It is a 3-yearly review, which allows both sides of the argument to get off on themselves, but at the end of the day, what we've got to do is provide a policy that is fair and recognises we're trying to help with the gambling harm, but we're also not trying to drive people out of this town as well in terms of their investment in their businesses that they have. So I think Councillor Donaldson's number 4, that we review it again in 3 years rather than waiting for 6 years, because I think that's been part of the problem, is sensible, and I'm happy to second that.
Thank you very much, Councillor Stewart, and thank you, councillors. and our other members for the discussion this morning. This is really quite an emotive subject. I know whether you were present at the hearings or whether you've seen them later online, or whether, of course, read them as well. The people are quite passionate. Yes, thank you, Councillor. Quite passionate, actually, about gaming. My own belief is that I don't think this is well informed enough. I can understand that we're going on what we've already had in policy before, and we're looking to how we can enhance that. I fail to understand why we would want to see machines taken out of the suburbs and put into the CBD for very much the reasons, Councillor Stewart, that you said. If you think you've got higher visibility in the CBD, don't believe it, because that is not true. You've got just the same amount of visibility, possibly more so, in the smaller suburban locations than you actually have in the city as well. So I think that I would have liked to have seen a sinking lid. I'd like to see that we would have that, and if anything, it's gone up by 2. So I don't believe this will have the desired effect that we're looking for. So yes, it would be interesting to see how the vote goes when it's put. Yes, Your Worship.
I'm seeing, as I expect on an issue like this, quite a divided council, but for the right reasons, because we charged our officers with a high-level principle of trying to reduce the harm. They've come back with a policy. Either we ask them to go back and work on the policy even further to reflect the split that we have raised here, or we accept this today and review it in 3 years. I have noted that for all who spoke passionately about reduction of harm, no one's proposed an amendment, which is the political tool that individual members have got to put an amendment on this agenda item. So they've spoken passionately, but the status quo remains. So
Point of order, Madam Chair. We couldn't, because we hadn't got a motion on the table, so we couldn't move an amendment at that point. We can now. I'm
saying we now can, if any individual wishes to propose an amendment, like Councillor Donaldson has. So that's our option. Either put an amendment up there that reflects the passion and we put it to the vote, or ask officers to bring something back. I do want to say on that one, they've tried twice, and I think they find it quite difficult too. So we've got to find a way forward here, and I'm just going to sit and I hope you don't put the vote yet, in case someone has got an amendment.
Yes, and it might be more than one amendment. And I mean, nobody said it was going to be easy, this policy. So, and it may be a number of amendments, I'm not sure. But there've been a number of, you're right, Your Worship, there've been a number of issues raised to suggest that certainly in 3 years' time we'd have to review it if in fact it does get the thumbs up today, but that might not be the case. So we'll just have some further discussion, I think. I'm happy to take some further discussion. Yes, Councillor Kent.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to propose an amendment that the item lie on the table to the next meeting to give the staff the opportunity to reflect on what we have said today to see if there is some way of satisfying all our objectives.
That's quite open, and there's been so much that's been captured today, so I just wonder if we can...
It has to be, Madam Chair, because anything else would be contrary to that, which would be against the rules.
Right. Councillor Donaldson.
So I just have a question on that proposed amendment, Madam Chair, through you. If we're going to come back with another version, do we need to start the whole consultation process again? That's my question.
I wouldn't think so. I wouldn't think so, because we've really, it's our deliberation that we're coming back to again, isn't it? It's really going over the discussions that we've had today, trying to tighten it down in some areas. So, but I'll put that question to you, or put that to you for comment, JB.
Councillors, I suppose what we were taking was that the options that were sent out in the draft policy highlighted
that was 4. 4, that's right.
Yeah. So we believe been operating within what's quite, we went out with a proposal which was to do the sinking lid and not provide relocation. So we believe we used the simplest tools at its most extreme, I think was what someone described it as, versus what our status quo position was. So what we've done here is tried to suggest another way that fell within the bounds of what's been discussed and the tools that were available and signalled within the draft. So if we come back with another option, as long as we fit within the rules that we've been given, which are, as we've said, quite limited. Again, the tools are pretty blunt. If we were to go away and try and reflect some of those, I believe we would come back with possibly the same answer, which is if you try and trade off one against the other of moving out of the suburbs, you create a policy position where people will avoid moving to overcome the risk of losing machines, because it's, as I said, it's the first movers who lose in this situation. So my only comment would be to say is if you're keen to see the current number of machines moving around the CBD, we've said that you can relocate within the CBD, and I think that picks up on Councillor Donaldson's comments there around that concern raised by those who currently have businesses that they may want to move their premises within the CBD. So that's current venues. So relocation is permissible within the CBD. Our comment about preventing relocations in the suburbs, because the feedback we had was that was wrong, was to give people who currently have those venues and those machines the opportunity to move back to the city. So there's, however, if we put in place a cap, then that relocation move back to the CBD is not achieved. So I suppose what you're in effect saying is that we have relocations of current levels of machines within the CBD, but we have imposed a cap and a sinking lid on suburban premises, which may not achieve over our policy time frame any movement, because at that point the business may not be viable, and I say may because a number of us said that is their concern. It's a part of their business, it's not the total element of their business, but it may prevent them from reopening their business. So it's to me it is quite a simple situation. If you want to impose a cap, then you're actually saying and we keep the view about suburban, then we are actually saying we're seeking to see them reduced numbers, and they would come from the suburban areas, which might end up with a policy failure where people try and stay where they are. So that's just the only comment I would say at that point. So we could go away, but really I've been coming back with an arbitrary cap figure if that's what you wanted, and really I'm still taking away that there is a strong view that the CBD is the right place and the suburban areas are the wrong place. It's just that the use of the cap to achieve a wider outcome is the issue you have. But I think in that decision you risk making our policy fail, for better words.
Thank you, JP. JP, on page 19, there were just the four issues that we actually went out and publicly consulted on. And can I just remind everybody that was the first one was adopt a sinking lid and no relocations. That was the preferred option. The second one was lower the cap and no relocations, clear as. The third one, adopting a sinking lid or lower the cap but allow relocations, or the status quo with refinements to relocations. And so those were the four that we consulted on. So any amendment would have to in some way ensure that we weren't, I'm not saying breaching, but we weren't acting outside of that. So thank you for that. Councillor Kent.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And on that point, if you increase the number, you've got to go back out to consultation, because we did not consult on increasing the number. So I come back to what I've suggested, which is the procedural motion that it lie on the table to allow the staff to further investigate, because I firmly believe we can separate relocations with the right to retain existing numbers from new venues opening up. and it's the new venues opening up that need to be subject to the cap, not the relocations. So I'm quite sure by splitting the two, we can actually counter the problem that JP raised.
Your Worship? Coming to
I don't really have a problem with where Councillor Kent's coming from. If we were to put the motion and it was lost, that's in effect what happens.
Madam Chair, the procedural motion has to be heard first.
Yeah. That's right. That's what I'm saying. Yeah.
Speaking
Yes,
to the
Councillor
amendment,
Kent.
speaking to the amendment, I will be supporting that the matter lie on the table because I hear what Ms Morrison said regarding evidence. I mean, if we're going to do a relocation, which I think in round terms we all support, I'm in favour of a lower cap and getting them out of the suburbs, and that's what the submissions I read said loud and clear. However, I want to know that there's capacity within the CBD for those relocations to occur, or do they just fall off? So therefore you may achieve your cap reduction down to 300 over 5 years or whatever, but at this stage I don't know. So I think this needs a complete relook at it, and I'll be supporting the motion, the procedural motion that lay on the table to come back with the other options.
Thank you. Councillor Donaldson, did you have something? I thought I've got your name here. Maybe I was just looking at you. So you're okay with, thank you very much. Oh, yes, Ms Morrison.
Thank you. Given we're talking about things a little bit different from where we started, I just wanted to be clear that the thing that I'm actually really concerned about is that, I'll give you the specific clause, it's clause C, subpara 6. I'd like to see page 40, education facility included into that mix, because I think that would include PTEs, any child day, after school activity groups that happen in the CBD, which a definition of community facility doesn't include. And so education facility is a defined term in your district plan. So that I just wanted to be very clear. That's probably for me the biggest thing. It gives us a nice broad scope, officers a nice broad scope to assess that 100 metre radius. Or
100 metre? Oh, yes, it is. That's right, it is. Thank you. Yes. Yes, Your Worship.
Are you suggesting there, Anna, that we change the word school for educational facility?
It's up to the officers as
Because,
to,
well, there
as to
are
the
new
phrasing.
models emerging. I get what you
education
mean.
Facility.
So it might be, they're not just schools,
No.
that's
Yeah.
what,
It's a broader term, but as they see fit, it could be and or could be or. You could include education facility and community facility. It's just a nice, it's quite a broad,
Councillor
yet
Gould?
defined term.
Oh, thank you. Councillor Gould?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm a little bit concerned about the suburban areas, that they're not able to change from one suburban area to another suburban area, because the trade is going to change in the future, and we don't know where it's going to go. We don't know whether there's going to be a U complex in Nongatawa or a U complex in Eastside or anywhere. And I still think we need to have some sort of vision to protect those sorts of cases. If an operator wants to spend X amount of dollars and he reckons he can get into a UA type area, which is not going to be harmful for the people of the area, then he should be able to have the opportunity of moving the machines.
Thank you. I think I just want to thank you for that. Oh, yes, Councillor Hunt. I'll just get some.
So the motion on the table is essentially on the status quo point, as Councillor Kent has raised. Okay, understanding that, I think that obviously it's going to need to come back, but I think that we need to be really clear that we can put any number cap we want, and we can feel really good about it, and it can achieve very little. We did that in the last 2004 when we last did it. We felt really good about our low cap. Great, we're going to nail this gambling nut on the head, and we're going to make significant changes in our community. and diddly squat happened, actually. The only ones that changed were business decisions that is not part of this hearing. So I think I look forward to it coming back. I'm not really expecting it to be very different. I would hope that those who were not in attendance will watch the online taped submissions, because it's very different from reading simply the written ones to having people who are willing to sit and present. And we only barely had a quorum. And every time this policy comes up, we only barely have a quorum, because no one wants to touch this. It's one of the tough decisions councils make. It's not a popular one. You're wrong. By half your friends think you're wrong, whichever decision you make, and half the groups you belong to also feel that way. So we're going to have another hash at this uncomfortable subject, but it's a subject that we are here to make a decision on. And it's got to be pragmatic, it's got to be based. You can't simply put someone out of business because you don't like the business they're in. And that's, you know, they're operating legally. Now, I may not be a gambler myself, but it's an individual choice. And what I'm trying to do here is find a policy and not rehash time and again, with half the people not being here so we can have a proper discussion the first time round. Let's nail it. Let's actually sit down and let's not expect the staff to labour over this. They've done enormous work on this. And really it's our decision making here that, for me, that's an error, not the report. I accept that procedural motion about the status quo being out of 2. I have no problem with that. But I do hope we'll move on and make a decision, because it is a philosophical one and we'd all like to make the decision that makes us feel good. But we have to do the decision, for me, that's actually right and legal and fair.
Thank you. Now we're getting into some more talk. So, Mr. Thomas, and I'm going to slowly draw it to a close.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Look, I'm assuming that the amendment that the motion lie on the table is passed. I'm aware of the fact that there were very few of us here for the submissions, and I wonder if before this came back for formal deliberations, it might be appropriate to have some sort of less formal, more informal workshop amongst us, where we could actually be looking at other options rather than relying on staff to go away and come back with a very built-up model for us. Perhaps a more informal environment where we could actually give them some direction of what we're thinking about might be helpful.
Yes, I think that we have gone through a process. We've heard submissions. We've had an opportunity to go online and have a look at them after the event if we haven't been here. We've read them. We've talked to other councillors. I don't wish to go down that track again. And I don't know if it would serve, if we'd get any further on. I mean, we've heard some good discussion this morning. I'd just like to get some clarity really about when it lies on the table, what next before the next meeting. That's really important. I think we've got a good document here, we've already got a policy and we're building on that, trying to refine it. So we're not starting from scratch. So there were a couple more comments, and then I am going to put the motion and then give Councillor Kent as the mover last shot at it. Councillor Donaldson.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I think we can deal with this today, and I can't move another amendment because I've moved the substantive. So, but I hear where Councillor Kent's coming from, and I don't have a problem with that. And I think it can be easily accommodated. If I look at the paragraph C location on page 40 and the strikeout of 380 to 382. So if his procedural motion was more along the lines of that the policy comes back to the full council with a mechanism there, and I'll leave the wordsmithing to JP, that the cap remains at the status quo of 380, but that it is not invoked if a premise moves from the suburbs to the CBD. And then it could be amended before it comes back to the full council. And if Councillor Kent went that way with it, I'd be happy for that motion, and then we could get it dealt with.
Thank Thank you, thank you. I like the sound of that. Councillor Kent?
And that was actually reflected in the motion I actually moved, which was said to allow the staff to review the policy in light of comments that we've received today.
Yes, thank you. That's around the capping, around
Yep.
the sink. Thank you. Could we better
I think as a recommendation for us to take forward to council, if that was the option, the insertion of the words "and other education facilities" is probably fairly safe amendment, and it adds to the intent that's already detailed there, because we have said schools, early childhood, kindergartens and places of worship, just to have a education facilities in its wider sense recognises that there's others. So look, I think that's a minor amendment. If you had the will to impose a 380 cap, then what you're suggesting, we've already got suburban are able to relocate to the CBD without a loss. So there's no, so we, by interpreting that cap, then we're saying, so we can take that you're putting a cap and it will not affect suburban moves. So we can just subtly change, there might be one word we need to change there. So it won't be the suburban mover who is the one who loses the two. It will be a inner city mover around that risks losing the two machines. So that's the way of protecting the capping discussion. Well, I don't
What has been suggested is separate the cap limit from relocations, period. Right? The policy needs to state that if you relocate, you can retain your numbers, regardless of whether you're outside of the CBD or in the CBD, but preferably you're moving into the CBD because that's what we want to happen. But that should be separate from the cap. The cap should limit establishment of new venues, and if a venue closes down, sorry, we don't want another one.
Yeah.
All right, I think we've just had a sideline conversation while you were restating that. Then that would work. It would only take us a small amount of wording changes to achieve that. We wouldn't have to separate them out. We can just change the words. So if the view is to say a cap is retained at 380, and we'll make sure that that's there in clarity, but also that relocation option from the suburbs is clear as well. So we can achieve that as a minor amendment if that's the preference. And if you then recommend to council that the council report would then have the track changes which details that, because again you're only recommending to council, so you're recommending some amendments to be in the policy for adoption by council.
So that could come to the next full council meeting with those changes, because we've had the discussion. We're pretty clear now where we're going to land.
Why don't we change it to lie on the table until the next council meeting to allow staff to... That then does it. And there is one other minor thing while you're reviewing things. On page 43, you refer to society repeatedly, which is not in part of the definitions and is not in line with the rest of the definitions of venues.
Just want to be clear that we can go, it can come before the next full council meeting with those changes made. It doesn't have to, yes, yeah.
Councillors, you have to recommend through. It doesn't lie on the table for council, it would lie on the table for SPNF.
Yes.
So that's why I believe we need to recommend with those amendments to council.
Sorry, I think we've then got a procedural problem, because if it then comes to full council and we don't like it, it has to then go back to this committee. Yeah, well, I think they'd have to, because it's this committee that made the recommendation. So, I mean, I don't see any issue with it actually lying on the table. Get the report here, let's finalise it next meeting, because it should be relatively quick, having had all the discussion today. And then if everyone's in favour, we approve it and it goes forward.
Councillor Hunt, I didn't hear.
Sorry, Madam Chair. If the procedural motion, if the mover and the seconder are happy to withdraw that, then it comes to full council with the tract amended. We either vote on it as accepted in the tract version, or if we still believe it needs reworking, it lays on the table and comes back, gets sent back to the SPNF committee for further work.
So we're moving it along.
Yes, so we're moving it along. If we lay it on the table for this committee, that's another whole 6-week series, and then everyone's forgotten what everyone said, and we have to repeat it again. So if we do this, this is the most, this,
Point of
So,
order, Madam
yes,
Chair. We
yes.
have another issue that then raises in that our Te Tato Board and our Community Board and our Rural Board would have no input or say into the revised version. Whereas currently, if it comes back to this committee, they do have a say in the vote prior to moving to council.
That's a point. Yes, yes, Your Worship.
But they're here today. So we're doing an indication without the procedural motion, and we'll receive the policy at council. And subject to those amendments.
Yes, that's, yes.
So they're having great input, very constructive. I don't think we need to wait another cycle. Yeah. Can
Be contained. Sorry. Yes, Ms Morrison.
I've just spoken with Mr Berryman-Camp, and we're comfortable with this going straight to council, as provided that the wording reflects
Yes, yeah,
accurately
what we've
what we've talked about today. We've got confidence in the staff to reflect it accurately.
Yeah. Yes, I think it would be good if we can move this one through today. We've had a lot of discussion. It's been good discussion, and I wouldn't like to think it's going to come back to another SPNF and then we go through the same discussion again. So I'm going to say, Mrs Trumper.
Sorry, Madam Chair, I've got a little lost now, and I just need a point of clarification. Is the motion going to allow movement within a suburb? Because I need to find out, and I need Rotorua defined then, please. Because Rotorua, if
clarify, Madam Chair, it's the inner city is one area, and all the others, we refer to it as suburbs, but it's the rest of the district where there are machines.
Which includes Rotorua.
Which includes Rotorua. So it includes the whole of our Rotorua community. You're either regarded as in the city,
or
in the CBD, or you're regarded in the other
block.
Sorry, just one more then. So in other words,
Sorry, excuse me, just one conversation at a time, please. Yes, sorry, Mrs Trump.
sorry, I just, then to further that, if something happens in Rotorua, they can't relocate within Rotorua. It has to be at the Woolshed Tavern or nowhere.
That's as it would stand, yes, by the policy, yes, that's
Thank
right.
you.
Thank you. JP, you wanted to have a word, and I'm going to let Councillor Kent.
Madam Chair, and maybe I might be taking some of the comments that Councillor Kent might be saying. But councillors, if you were to take what you've suggested as the amendments, and so if you took away the procedural motion there to say it lie on the table, because you can't lie it on the table because it lies on the table for this committee. If you were to say that you want those 3 amendments made and reflected in the document to go to council, they should be picked up and put within recommendation 3, which is the committee recommends to council that the amendments to Class 4 gambling policy, including the following additions, be approved. So we're taking away with minor amendments. So we actually embedded in area 3.
Thank you. Yes, Councillor Kent.
That's actually what I was going to suggest. So can I just reword that before you go retyping it all?
Yes.
It says, so 3 becomes, as shown in attachment 2, track change versions be approved, subject to amendments to reflect.
Amendments to reflect.
No, they're not just following minor amendments. It's subject to amendments to reflect the separation or the retention of cap. The reduction in the retention of cap at 380, and the retention of existing numbers by businesses that relocate. Would that do it?
And then and the educational, the policy one, read the schools. sorry. Make sure that that's actually a true reflection of what we've been talking about. That the committee recommend to council. I think that's pretty much it. Okay.
Madam Chair, then I'm happy to withdraw the procedural motion and move that motion as now amended.
Thank you. Now, I think we've got a councillor. Oh, yes, there you are. Thank you. Is there any further discussion on this point? And thank you for your comments today, councillors. But is there any further discussion? Fine, thank you. Then I'm going to put, where are we? 2, 3 and 4. Can you just come? Thank you. 2, 3 and 4. Oh, sorry, that was our minutes of the hearing. So, sorry, 3 and 4. Thank you, Carol. Number 3, that the committee recommend to council that the amendments to the Class 4 gambling and board venue policy as shown in attachment 2, track changes version, be approved, subject to amendments to reflect the retention of the cap at 380, and that relocations be permitted with their original number of machines, and that the policy regarding schools include the words and other educational facilities. 4, that the committee recommend that council reviews the Class 4 gambling and board venue policy after 3 years. It's been moved by Councillor Kent, seconded by Councillor Gould. All those in favour, please say aye. Contrary, thank you, carried. Oh, thank you, Councillor. Sorry? Oh, you voted against, thank you. So there were 2 against, Councillor Stewart and Mr. Thomas and Mrs. Trumper wish to be recorded against. Thank you for that. I just wonder if we could take a 10-minute break and then we'll go into, oh, actually, do I move? I'll just move now, public excluded now, that the resolution to go into public excluded. First of all, to adopt the confidential minutes of the previous meeting, and secondly, to consider the confidential report regarding a Polynesian spa admission charge increase. The reasons for us going into a confidential, public excluded, is A, to protect the privacy, yes, of natural persons, and B, to protect the information where the making available of the information would likely unreasonably